On Friday, 2nd April 1909, the day began as normal for John Gray, a lorryman. The 39-year-old worked for the North British Railway Company in Fort William and left his home early to get to work for 6 o'clock that morning. He'd made himself and his wife Margaret a cup of tea, which he took to her as she was still in bed, the kitchen doubling up as their bedroom. The couple had 2 children, Robert William, aged 10, and 8-year-old Agnes Anderson, who were still asleep in the other room. He told his wife he would be back at 9 o'clock for breakfast, then left. He later stated she seemed in good spirits, but soon his world was turned upside down. It was still dark as Gray left his cottage on Fassifern Road and made his way down the hill to the railway station. He passed 2 workmen on their way up the hill, their heads bowed, as it was a dreich morning. Neither spoke to him. The Grays had moved to Fort William from Helensburgh after he'd been offered a position in the town with the railway. John and Margaret were deeply religious and were instrumental in opening a temperance movement in Fort William. They became highly respected members of the community. However, after work, John never went to the public houses with his work colleagues, but instead went straight home to be with his wife and family. The children too were well liked by their friends and classmates, as well as the older people in the town. Once his early shift was over, Gray returned to his home for breakfast, as was his custom. By that time, the house would normally be awake, with the stove lit and the house warm. The children were on holiday from school that day, so he expected to hear them, but the house was silent and the curtains remained drawn. Something was different. As he entered, the hallway was in darkness, with only the peep of daylight beginning to show. The lamps hadn't been lit, so he called out for his wife. "Maggie," he called. Then he heard a muffled sound coming from the back of the house. He called out again, "Maggie, I'm home," but there was still no answer. As he moved along towards the kitchen, he saw it was still in darkness. The table hadn't been laid, and the fire wasn't lit. One thing that grabbed his attention was his razor. It had been moved from the windowsill by the sink where he'd left it, and the back door to the yard was unbolted. He opened the door to the children's bedroom as they should have been up, and the sight that greeted him was horrific. The 2 shared a bed, and if it had not been for the blood seeping from the terrible wounds inflicted on their heads and their blankets soaked in blood, they could have been mistaken for sleeping. Gray was horrified. His beloved children had been murdered. He made his way to the kitchen to sit down, reeling from what he saw, when he noticed his wife lying slumped on the floor in the far corner, blood oozing from a deep gash at her throat. Nearby was his razor, a bread knife, and a small blood-stained hatchet. Her whole face and neck were covered in cuts, and she held her hand to her throat. Gray rushed towards her. She was still alive. He called her name, then rushed into the street and shouted for help. Medical assistants and friends and neighbours arrived at the house quickly, as did a police constable. First aid was given, and as Margaret was being treated, she slipped in and out of consciousness, trying to speak, but her words were lost. She was rushed to the Belford Hospital in the town. As news spread and speculation rose that she had murdered her children, a police guard was sent to her hospital bed. That afternoon, Sheriff Donald Davidson, along with the Deputy Procurator Fiscal Mr. A. Mackenzie, Inspector Chisholm and Police Sergeant E. Mackenzie, all went to the hospital to interview her, but the doctors said she was in no state to answer their questions at that time. Meanwhile, Gray himself was questioned by detectives. They asked about the hatchet, which Gray kept in an outhouse for chopping wood, and whether the outhouse had been locked. It was not, but the children knew not to go to the outhouse or touch anything there. The detectives also asked about Margaret's state of mind, and Gray told them that she had been depressed over the winter, but had been feeling better of late. He told them she loved Robert and Agnes more than anything in the world. Neighbours too were questioned, and the police were told the same thing. She was devoted to her children, and they'd never heard any arguments between her and her husband. Two tradesmen who'd been working in a neighbouring cottage said they never heard any disturbance that morning. Whether these two were the men Gray had passed earlier that morning couldn't be ascertained. Gray told the police that his wife would never murder his children, so there had to be another explanation. On Tuesday, 6th April, the funerals of the two children took place. The service took place in the open at the hospital, led by the Reverend R.B. Crawford of Kilmally and the Reverend John McIntosh of Fort William. It was a sombre affair, with shops closing for the day and the bells tolling in sombre fashion. A large crowd gathered to pay their respects, including members of the Boys' Brigade and the Girls' Guild. Then the two little coffins covered with floral tributes were taken to Helensburgh, where they were buried beside the Gray family. Meanwhile, Margaret seemed to be making a slight recovery, but she told the police officer who stood by her bedside that she couldn't remember anything about the incident. She then developed sepsis and lost consciousness. She died on 18th May, aged 39. She was buried in secret in an unmarked grave due to the strong feelings of the townsfolk. John Gray never fully recovered from what happened that day. He left Fort William, returning to Dunbartonshire, before emigrating to South Africa after World War I. He died in 1948, and until his dying day believed his wife could not have murdered his children. Questions remain in this case, but it was closed by the investigating authorities, their belief being Margaret Gray had murdered her children, then had attempted to take her own life. It was one of the darkest days in Fort William's history. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.